and early childhood of Yeshua, his education. Education in Old Testament times, the primary purpose of education among the Jews was the learning of and obedience to the law of God, the Torah. Whereas the word Torah can be used to refer to all Jewish beliefs, it generally refers to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The secondary purpose in education was to teach about the practical aspects of everyday life: a trade for the boy and the care of the house, application of dietary laws, and how to be a good wife for the girl. The home was considered the first and most effective agency in the education process, and parents were considered the first and most effective teachers of their children. This responsibility is expressed in Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, where God states his expectation that Abraham will train his children and his household to walk in the ways of the Lord. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6 is another familiar exhortation for parents to teach their children according to the way of the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 gives an interesting insight into how parents were to teach their children about God. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. The parent was to use the various ordinary activities of life as avenues to teach about God. All of life was permeated by religious meaning, and teaching about God should flow naturally from its activities. Primary ways of imparting religious knowledge to children were example, imitation, conversation, and stories. Parents could utilize the interest aroused in their children by actual life observances, such as Sabbath or Passover, to teach about God. Training in the Torah began very early. The father had an obligation to teach his children the law by words and example. A child could observe his father binding the phylacteries on his arm and head. The natural question, "What are you doing?" could be used to teach the child that it was everyone's duty to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might, which can be referred in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. Education in New Testament times, the synagogue apparently came into existence during the Babylonian captivity when the Jews were deprived of the services of the temple. During captivity, they began meeting in small groups for prayer and scripture reading. When they returned to Israel, the synagogue spread rapidly and developed into an important educational institution. Synagogue services made an important educational contribution to the religious life of the community. The elementary school system among the Jews developed in connection with the synagogue. Even before the days of Jesus, schools for the young were located in practically every important Jewish community. The teacher was generally the synagogue attendant. An assistant was provided if there were more than 25 students. The primary aim of education at the synagogue school was religious. The Old Testament was the subject matter for this instruction. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were also taught. Memorization, drill, and review were used as approaches to teaching. Boys usually began formal schooling at the house of the book at age between 5 and 7. He would spend at least a half day, 6 days a week for about 5 to 6 years studying at the synagogue. Parents brought their son at daybreak and came for him at midday. While not at school, the boy was usually learning a trade, such as farming or carpentry. If a boy wanted training beyond that given in a synagogue, he would go to a scholarly scribe. Saul of Tarsus received such advanced theological training at the feet of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, which can be referred in Acts chapter 22, verse 3. It was the custom of the Galilean Jews for the mother to bear the responsibility for a child's training until the 5th birthday, and then, if the child were a boy, to hold the responsible for the boy's education from that time on. This can be referred in the Urantia book 123, 2.13. Though father was assuming the direct responsibility for boys' intellectual and religious education after his 5th birthday, his mother still interested herself in his home training, as stated in the Urantia book 123, 2.14. Prior to formal education, Yeshua was a fluent reader, writer, and speaker of 2 languages, Aramaic, from his mother Miriam, and Greek, from his father Joseph. At the age of between 5 and 7 years old, Jewish children were supposed to begin their formal education in the synagogue schools, as stated in the Urantia book 123, 5.1. When Yeshua grew up as a boy in the village of Nazareth, he no doubt attended the synagogue school. Generally, the Jewish child was sent to school between the 5th and 7th year of his life. The pupils either stood, teacher and pupils alike, or else sat on the ground in a semicircle, facing a teacher. Until the children were 10 years of age, the Bible was the one textbook. The child grew and became strong. He was full of wisdom, and God's blessings were upon him. This can be referred in Luke chapter 2, verse 40. During the formal education, the child learned to read, write, and speak the Hebrew language. Formal education was divided into 2 sections: elementary school for initial 3 years and advanced school in following 3 years. After 6 years of formal education, the child was graduated from the schools of Nazareth Synagogue and was turned over to his parents by the synagogue rulers as an educated son of commandment. Henceforth, a responsible citizen of the Commonwealth of Israel, all of which entailed his attendance at the Passovers in Jerusalem. Accordingly, he attended his first Passover that year in company with his father and mother, which can be referred in the Urantia book 123, 5.2, Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 42. And when they fulfilled the days, they returned, and on the way they found him not with them. They turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him as stated in Luke chapter 2, verses 43 to 45. It appears it was on the 3rd day after the festival that his parents found him in the temple area. He was not playing with other boys, lost or even scared to be on his own. He was instead involved in serious discussions with some of the learned teachers of the law in Jerusalem, both listening to them and asking them questions. This can be referred in Luke chapter 2, verse 46. Rather than being annoyed by one so youthful, these intelligent men were astounded by Yeshua's questions and responses, and most importantly, by his grasp of deep theological topics. Luke's account in Luke chapter 2, verse 47, which says, "All who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers." Yeshua's teacher confidently believed that his alert and diligent pupil was destined to some outstanding career, some distinguished mission. The elders, notwithstanding all their trouble with Yeshua's nonconformist tendencies, were very proud of the child and had already begun laying plans which would enable him to go to Jerusalem to continue his education in the renowned Hebrew academies as soon as he reaches the required age of 15. As Yeshua heard these plans discussed from time to time, he increasingly sure that he would never go to Jerusalem to study with the rabbis. This can be found in the Urantia book 124, 5.5, 5.6,